This video has been a long time coming. I know, I'm late relatively, in comparison to all the other journalists who pretty much sped read it, within the first 24 hours of its leaking in Spain. But I have a life. Who am I kidding? There are two reasons why I think I should stop brandishing his face, on camera for now. There are two reasons why it took me, I guess, a little bit longer than everyone else to do this. Number one, I was waiting for a secondhand copy to be available, which eventually it was. And number two, I simply didn't want to read it. I'm not gonna lie, it was like homework. It was like this assignment that I really didn't want to do, but I know I just had to get it over with. And here we are. I really hope you stick around for this entire video, because what I aim to do is to give you a different review in comparison to what most of the media has been churning out, where the same headlines were rehashed over and over again. The Taliban this, Todger that. So what I hope to do in this review is to, rather than, churn out a few salacious parts here and there, I want to give you an overall understanding of the themes of the book, and of course, while highlighting inconsistencies, hypocrisy, and the victimhood that this book is absolutely riddled with. Starting off with the synopsis, this thing, it's right here on the cover of the book. And this thing reads like a fantastical fairy tale that is absolutely fictitious, which, by the way, most of the book reads that way too. Listen to this. Then he met Meghan. The world was swept away by the couple's cinematic romance and rejoiced in their fairy tale wedding. But from the beginning, Harry and Meghan were preyed upon by the press, subjected to waves of abuse, racism, and lies. Watching his wife suffer, their safety and mental health at risk, Harry saw no other way to prevent the tragedy of history repeating itself but to flee his mother country. Over the centuries, leaving the royal family was an act few had dared. The last to try, in fact, had been his mother. Dun dun dun. Yeah, it's dramatic as hell in there, which makes me think Meghan was quite heavily involved, being the actress that she is. Very briefly about the structure of the book, it's divided into three separate parts. So you've got part one, which deals with Harry's formative years, part two, which deals with his time in the army, and finally, of course, part three, we all know, enter Meghan Markle. And I have to say, as an avid reader, strictly from a literary point of view, okay? I'm not talking about the quality or substance of the content or of the story, just the writing, the grammar. The ghostwriter, who I believe is, an acclaimed author, is a really good writer. And I'm only saying this because his writing is what enabled me to even read this book. Because I tell you, if it was filled with the rubbish that it's filled with, but written in a really bad way, I wouldn't have done it, in all honesty. But that's pretty much where the praise begins and ends. In terms of substance, the book, to me, honestly read like it was a very well-written, fictitious diary of a 12-year-old boy. And it's no coincidence that it sounds that way, because you can tell from part one that Harry's maturity and his development pretty much stunted with the passing of his mother when he was 12 years old. And I think even he acknowledges at some point in the book, or maybe his therapist, the therapist that wasn't available for Meghan in her darkest days, but was available for him when his necklace broke. I think I recall a discussion of him being stuck there in that time frame of 1997. And as sad as that is, it really does explain a lot about not just Harry himself, but the way he almost, infantilizes himself and looks up to Meghan as this mother figure, which is one of the things that makes the entire world incredibly uncomfortable about the dynamics of their relationship. So despite Harry not literally writing it, his immature tone just unmistakably permeates through the words, frequently trying to interject humor and sarcasm, which in my opinion, for the most part, just fell flat on its face. There are a few times I had a chuckle, but overall, it was a lot of cringe and a lot of eye rolling. But what really stood out to me was his conviction throughout his childhood and even young adult years that his mother had disappeared deliberately to get away from the press rather than accepting her death, even though he was present at the funeral. Now, Harry states that William believes that as well, but given Harry's track record with credibility, I have taken every single quotation he has attributed to someone else with a truckload of salt. And boy, does he do a lot of attributing. Or hearsay, as I should call it, because that's exactly what it is. Statements of fact that are being introduced in the book to prove to the reader that something is in fact true. That is the legal definition of hearsay. And it is generally inadmissible because of its very suspect nature, and you need the original author of the statement to come up and verify that they've said that, as opposed to, oh yeah, I was told by such and such, and you should believe me. That doesn't fly in a court of law, so it didn't fly with me. But basically, true to form, the entire book is littered with quotes from third parties, some of which we don't even know a name, like, oh, a security guard, this guy, my bodyguard. But basically, quotes made by other people that back up every single thought, act, belief, or notion that Harry and or Meghan have. So basically, another form of validation. Oh, so-and-so said that we were right to feel this way. They agreed with us. And it was so immature, so childish. You can just tell. It's like, well, where's the evidence? Why should we believe you that these people are all backing you up? I mean, in one of the examples, the bodyguards in Canada who were pulled in 2020 because the Sussexes quit, and who, according to the media, were pissed off because they were being used as errand boys. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that was what was circulating at the time. Apparently, they were 100% fighting to stay to protect Harry and Meghan, and they wrote to the royal family about the injustice. Please just let us stay and protect them. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't know about you, but I just find that very hard to believe. So back to specifically part one, we also learned that Harry is confused and may have watched My Sister's Keeper all those many years ago, and may have had his wires crossed, which he admits not everything is well up there. For those of you who haven't seen that movie, it's basically about a second child, a sister, being born literally as a living receptacle of spare parts because her sister had cancer and was sick and she needed maybe a spare kidney, this and that, bone marrow. And that's what Harry says he was to William. So if you wanted a reason to take everything he says with a truckload of salt, I think I just gave it to you. Part one also happens to be where the famous Nazi incident is mentioned, because it turns out it took place right before he joined the army, not after, which defeats my arguments of the past of how can someone who was trained as an army officer not know about World War II. So now I'm going to revert to another argument, which is just as valid. How can someone who was 21 years old, or 20, he was turning 21, not know about what Hitler did? I mean, we all knew about it as children, and I'm significantly younger than Harry, so there is no way that he didn't learn about it. The only explanation is he wasn't paying attention in Eton because, by his own admission, he rarely did. So much for such an expensive education. I mean, I bet he took the place of a student who wasn't admitted that year and who probably deserved it a lot more than Harry did. But such is life with the rich and privileged. Anyways, this Nazi incident is mentioned, masquerading as, a mea culpa, when anyone with 2 brain cells can see it for exactly what it is: justification and excuses. He writes it as a mistake worth forgiving, unlike Thomas Markle and even Jeremy Clarkson, who apparently deserve to be publicly flogged and, in one instance cancelled because of one silly mistake. And surprise, surprise, he does the exact same thing about the second racist slur that he makes years after the Nazi incident by using an inappropriate term to refer to a Pakistani member of the army who served alongside him. Exact same deal. I didn't know any better. I didn't mean anything by it. And therefore, I am absolved of all blame and worthy of forgiveness. I mean, it really reeks of that hypocrisy and that, I am above everyone else. I can fly private jets, but you can't even go on, commercial flights for holidays. And I can say whatever racist slur I want and still be worthy of forgiveness. But the Thomas Markles of the world, nah, they're complicated. Turns out, Harry's experience of the army is so entirely different to mine and to the experiences of those around me. He essentially pulls a Meghan and uses this part of the book as a platform to directly contradict everything that we commonly know about him, being that he flunked his entrance exam and he was only, accepted because he was a prince. He was a puppet prince. He didn't have to actually go through all of the hard work like the rest of us had to, etc., etc. So he contradicts every single one of these and paints himself out to be the perfect soldier. I passed the entrance exam with flying colors. I was a great shot. Other people were struggling to land the helicopter and I was great. I was a natural at landing it. It was just a lot of bravado and self-congratulation. And mind you, as someone who had to pass an officer selection board to even train at my officers training institution, it's not an easy thing to pass. In fact, there is such a high fail rate. Only a tiny percentage of applicants in my intake ended up getting through. So this once again lends me to think, really, Harry, did you really pass these exams? Because I don't see any evidence of leadership in his youth, and his academic results were really nothing to write home about. Now, whether he was helped along or whether he achieved everything through his own merit, I suppose we'll never know. I know some people who served alongside him say otherwise. They say that he did nothing and he was basically, like I said, a puppet prince. But I can't prove that for a fact, so I'm not inclined to state that it's a fact. What I can say, though, is his experiences post-commission, so after he became an officer, are what made me raise my eyebrows so high, they almost disappeared into my hairline. For someone who spent 10 years in the army, the man barely served. Now, I know it's all summarized and it's a book, but his 10-year period of service was basically punctured, with humongous gaps of nothing, all while he was still technically a full-time serving member, which to me is unheard of, because you can't just sit around and do nothing for 2-3 years at a time, or even a few months at a time if you're not injured, not for good reason, and still be a full-time serving member without getting discharged. And that's how I can sum up Harry's 10 years. He served 2 very short-lived tours in Afghanistan, and they were short-lived because he was deemed too precious, by the way. The second one ended up in an attack on his base because the Taliban wanted to kidnap him, or worse, which, like I said in a previous video called The Chess Player, if you haven't seen it yet, ended up in the loss of the lives of 2 Marines. So things got really serious by his presence, and that's why he couldn't fully serve, which I understand is not necessarily his fault. But again, it was so bizarre to me that he even qualified to be promoted as a captain, which is an automatic promotion, by the way. After that, you have to have a bachelor's degree to get promoted to major and so forth, which people speculate is why he left the army in 2015, because he knew he was never gonna get a degree and he was therefore gonna be a captain forever. But even with an automatic promotion, I still don't see how he qualified to get promoted because of his measly service period. And as if that wasn't enough, he also had direct access, from the way he wrote it at least. He bypassed the chain of command in the army, which is not the way things are done. There is a chain of command for a reason and you have to go through it. But he bypassed it and had private meetings with top-ranking military officers like generals to beg them to give him a role that he can do. And they would bend over backwards to see what they can do to placate him. And that's how he ended up training and eventually piloting an Apache helicopter, according to him. Because again, many people are saying he never even passed those tests. He said he passed with flying colors. But the fact that he's putting this all out there in the book tells me how disconnected he is from reality, and not just the realities of living in this world, but the realities of being a serving member of a defense force. Because we don't get to approach generals and other high-ranking officers and beg them to come up with a solution for us and basically almost do our bidding. We can't even choose what location we can be posted to. We can put in preferences. You have, first preference, second preference. But at the end of the day, it is made very clear to us that it's not up to us where we're posted. In fact, even choosing the corps that you want to belong to, whether it's infantry, artillery, intelligence, at the end of the day, you put in your preference, but they may pick one for you. And that's just not what Harry's experience was. And the cherry on top is how he would write about during these periods of doing nothing, because he was deemed too precious, I suppose, to be risked, he would go traveling on amazing adventures during which he was apparently depressed. But it's so clear that he doesn't understand the privileged position he was in, where the rest of us don't have the privilege of having months and months on end of essentially a paid holiday, all expenses paid, traveling the world, going on amazing adventures that are fit for a fairy tale, which a lot of people are inclined to think that's what Spare is, just a fairy tale. But he just doesn't get it. It's more moping and complaining with absolutely no understanding of what it's like to actually be a disposable soldier and just another human being walking down the streets who doesn't have the privilege of spending a couple of weeks in Paris and a couple of weeks in Africa going on, safari tours. In a nutshell, if part 2 proved anything, it proved the opposite of what he apparently set out to do, which is, prove his macho-ness. To me, it only confirmed that he was indeed a puppet prince. Part 3. I could see the finish line when I got to this. I knew I just had to buck up and soldier on. In a nutshell, part 3 was, again, just another archetypes, just another platform for Meghan and Harry to shoot down and contradict every single negative headline that was ever printed about them. It was also the part that was, to me, almost certainly co-written by Meghan, at least based on the constant praising of her eternal youth and beauty. This perfect angel, the embodiment of innocence and perfection, always wronged, yet never wrong herself. But then he exposes her for who she really is without even meaning to, because the love bombing that this woman subjected him to. Wow. The games she played. And he just writes about it because you can tell he's this doofus who just doesn't see what she's doing. And I feel comfortable calling him a doofus because the names he calls pretty much everyone he doesn't like or agree with in his book, that was really a highlight of his immaturity, by the way. He is one of those nasty people who has a nasty name for everyone. So yeah, he's a doofus. I mean, I know they moved fast, but I didn't know how fast. And he tells us exactly how fast. And it looks like the privacy ship has well and truly sailed away from Montecito, or perhaps it never existed. Let me put it this way. The man pretty much dedicated an entire chapter, which granted, some of these chapters are like literally just a couple of paragraphs long, by the way, but a whole chapter as a prelude to some sexy times. Lovemaking, I don't know, it's all cringe. But after writing about his nether regions in the same paragraph as his mother's lips, are we really at liberty to be that surprised? Private conversations with Catherine and William that allegedly took place, because remember, hearsay, there were direct quotes in there. And someone with a memory as shot as Harry's and Meghan's, because they forgot they collaborated with Omid Scobie only a few months before filing a lawsuit. But they didn't forget exactly what Kate and William said on such and such day in 2018 or 2017 or 2019. Nah, that's all fresh in the memory. Right. But assuming these conversations are true, that's yet another violation of privacy right there. But again, what applies to them doesn't apply to the rest of us, does it? Essentially, this part was a written form of the Netflix docuseries. They'd have you believe, like I read out in the synopsis, that their experience was the most harrowing, the most dangerous, the most trying that anyone could ever imagine. A matter of life and death. And that's a direct quote. It was just full of constant complaining and wallowing in self-pity, telling the world how hard done they've been by the media and the royal family, all while writing about the life he was living with his family, which, as shown in the docuseries, is a life that is so idyllic, so fantastical, the very picture of absolute family bliss. Ironically, I think it is this life of absolute privilege that has given them so much spare time spare, you see what I did there? To obsess over the media, to obsess over, surfing the internet, finding every single negative headline they can find and festering over it and planning their revenge. If they had real jobs, if they had real life obligations, if they lived perhaps not paycheck to paycheck, but if their first and foremost priority was feeding their children and keeping a roof over their heads and making sure they're warm in the winter time, making sure bills are paid, schools are taken care of, university money is saved up, then perhaps they wouldn't be as fixated on the negative and hell-bent on this relentless journey for revenge, because they wouldn't have the time. Time is a luxury that a lot of us don't have. And it's so sad and ironic to see that those who have plenty of it, like these two, are squandering it on this, selling out your family for a quick buck. At one point, Harry talks about how they were really losing it. And so they called Elton John and his husband, and they sent them a private jet, and they went and spent a few days in, their French estate. And Harry writes this in a very self-pitying, woe is me, our lives are so difficult perspective. It's not gratefulness. But someone needs to tell Harry that when the rest of us are losing it, when the rest of us are struggling, when the rest of us can't fathom one more day of the grind, we don't have the luxury of calling up friends, let alone Elton John, to have them send us a private jet and spend a few days in the French Riviera or wherever the heck they were. We didn't have the luxury of someone letting us borrow their Vancouver mansion for free, presumably, so that we can spend some time there away from the fuss. And we certainly don't have the luxury of calling up Hollywood executives like Tyler Perry, who also, all expenses paid, sends a private jet, gives us security and unlimited access for an unlimited amount of time to his Hollywood mansion. I don't get it. Are they genuinely this disconnected? Or is it another way, like Meghan used to use her TIG blog and her Instagram, to flex, to show off, to tell us exactly what they have access to, what they can get away with, that the rest of us couldn't even dream of having a fraction of, a droplet of? Because to me, sometimes it just really comes across as the latter, a flex. And never mind that apart from the same handful, maybe 3 headlines that they keep churning over and over again that supposedly proves that the whole world or the whole nation is racist against Meghan, they present no evidence whatsoever in this book of any of this harassment. There are ridiculous stories that to me really come across as made up that justify certain things, like Meghan had this pap stroll in Kensington where she goes back to the palace using the main gate. And now apparently that was her being traumatized and trying to escape from a man who basically threatened her and started forcing her to take photos. I mean, we've never heard that story before, and she really didn't look all that traumatized in these photos. Once again, there's a photo that tells a very different story from what Harry and Meghan want us to believe. Kind of like that Netflix scene where they're in the car and no one is chasing them. Speaking of evidence, Harry also claims that they presented a 25-page report to Human Resources at the palace to contradict the bullying reports. And while I understand that things of this nature are kept private and confidential to protect the staff, for example, Harry and Meghan aren't exactly people who value privacy and confidentiality. In fact, their entire career thrives upon the exact opposite. So why haven't you shown us the report, or at least the evidence that you have attached to the report? Wouldn't that clear your name? And again, for the 100th time, if these accusations are false, why not sue? You've sued over a lot less. I want to finish off by reading you probably one of the most ironic, if not the most ironic sentences in this entire book. In page 370, Harry says, "This isn't about wanting or needing good press. It's about not letting people get away with abuse and lies, especially the kind of lies that can destroy innocence." I mean, what do you say to that other than 0 out of 10? Would not recommend. And a lot of woke publications would agree, by the way. This book, despite generating millions for them, is essentially a flop. Not monetarily, but, literally, I suppose. You know, my fireplace looks a little bit hungry back there. Perhaps I should feed it 400 pages worth of trash.